From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hi everyone, welcome. I have the same document printed out twice in two different point sizes because ever since I started wearing glasses, my eyesight has just gotten so bad. Before I forget, I want to say, especially on a beautiful day like this, why not go to a cold, dark establishment this evening? So why don't we all, whoever wants to go, let's have one of our meetings in the Tune In, the Kluge Annex just down Pennsylvania Avenue. It's a great pleasure to introduce our friend to all of us, Shaden Tageldin, who's Associate Professor of Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature in the Department of Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature at the University of Minnesota, where she's also the Director of the African Studies Initiative, a Title VI African Studies National Resource Center funded by the U.S. Department of Education. From 2013 to 2015, she was Director of Graduate Studies in that department, as well as for the Interdepartmental Graduate Minor in Moving Image Studies. She's the recipient of the 2013 to 14 Motley Exemplary Teaching Award from the College of Liberal Arts. In her teaching, she focuses on 19th and 20th century literatures in English, Arabic, and French. Her research engages several fields within a transnational and a translingual compass: empire and post-colonial studies, critical translation theory, trans-African and trans-Asian studies, the historiography of literary and cultural renaissances, the politics and ideologies of language, literary form, and literary genre, and literatures of migration and diaspora. She earned a PhD in comparative literature from UC Berkeley in 2004. Her first book, Disarming Words, Empire and the Seductions of Translation in Egypt, came out with University of California Press in 2011 and received honorable mention for the 2013 Harry Levin Prize of the American Comparative Literature Association. He was an old professor of mine at Harvard. And her doctoral dissertation won the ACLA's 2005 Charles Bernheimer Prize. She's currently here as a Frederick Burt Hark residential fellow, and she's writing a new book provisionally titled Toward a Transcontinental Theory of Modern Comparative Literature, and that is the title of today's talk. So please welcome Shaden. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ted, for that kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for coming on this lovely Tuesday afternoon. It is a great honor and pleasure to speak at the Library of Congress today. I've been fortunate indeed to spend this academic year in residency here at the library's Kluge Center as an American Council of Learned Societies Burkhardt Fellow. Few research centers offer an environment as warm, collegial, productive, and yes, provocative for thinking with others in different disciplines, changes the questions you ask, the sources you explore, and the answers you find. I would like to thank Ted Widmer, Mary Lou Reeker, Travis Hensley, Dan Torello, Anastasia Jones, Callie Mosley-Jackson, former Kluge staff members, Joanne Kitching and Denise Robinson, yes, I had to name everyone, as well as each and every one of the Kluge fellows I have met and engaged over the past 9 months for making my time here such a pleasure. Finally, I warmly thank Dr. Fawzi Tedros and his colleagues in the African and Middle Eastern Reading Room, as well as Eric Fraser and Mafon Ashman in Rare Books and Special Collections for their assistance in locating research materials, which is ongoing. I also thank Cheryl Adams in the main reading room, Erica Spencer in the European Reading Room, and Dr. Tomoko Steen in the Science Reading Room for their assistance at various points in my research thus far. The title of my lecture today, once again, is Toward a Transcontinental Theory of Modern Comparative Literature. Taking the case of Arabic, English, and French from the late 18th century through the early 20th, my lecture today is part of a book in progress that traces the rise of modern comparative literature to a new global regime in which a language acquired power in the world, empire, insofar as it held the power to observe and to capture the world exactly, empiricism. In the shadow of imperialism and empiricism, languages like Arabic that once had styled themselves incomparable, larger than life, now were urged to point unambiguously to all that they named, to simulate life, the really seen and really heard. This turn from artificial to natural literary languages newly bound word to world, making incomparable languages comparable. Comparable, that is, in their newly shared sense that words should be lifelike. In this determination of life, language was conceived in increasingly smaller, we might say molecular units. For the British Orientalist Sir William Jones, literatures could be made comparable only by breaking down and translating their literatures or their languages into lowest common denominators, plain-spoken words shorn of all ornament, all particularizing style, and sounds softened of all foreignness. Indeed, the word as denominator was not low or common enough. Comparison would demand, at times, an even freer radical. For French Orientalists like Volney and Ernest de Renan, the life of a language, hence its modernity, hence its comparability, hinged on whether or not its vowels were written, seen. For Egyptian and Syro-Lebanese intellectuals like Abdullah Nadim and Amin Shumail, on whether or not its consonants, translated, were heard across time and space. The epistemic conditions of possibility that ground modern comparative literature then demanded that the world's diverse languages be comparable to the letter. Not only must the graphemes, written signs, and phonemes, sounds of those languages be mutually intelligible, but so too the very relation, the very understanding of what the proper connection between a grapheme, a written sign, to a phoneme, a sound should be. Even today, comparative literature ascribes its disciplinary origins to Europe and the United States, often eliding developments elsewhere at the theoretical level. I ask, by revisiting this shared yet occluded history of language and life, can we develop a transcontinental theory of modern comparative literature? Before his conscription into the ranks of imperial governance in Bengal and into imperial views of the relationships between the world's languages and literatures, the young British Orientalist William Jones, not yet Sir William Jones, understood that literary comparison called on its practitioner to see with other eyes and to hear with other ears. That is, not to assume that the real or the knowable world ended with the seen and the heard, not to misapprehend the unknown, unfamiliar, or invisible world as unreal, or worse, as inferior to one's own. Jones opens his Dissertation sur la littérature orientale, dissertation on Oriental literature, and the title page is up here, written in French and published anonymously in London in 1771, with a counterfactual parable, a cautionary what if that marvelously inverts European imperial perception. And I quote, "A king of Siam," so present-day Thailand, "could not imagine that there could be in the world another kingdom than his own. He had, in truth, heard word of a race of animals that inhabited the Occident, but he had never seen them, for it meant nothing to him that Louis XIV had sent missionaries with the singular proposition that he abolish the cult of his ancestors and believe in mysteries despite himself. His courtiers told him that that race was nothing but a race of monkeys. His priests added that it was not capable of the metamorphoses of the great Fum Chi Ham, and his philosophers assured him that, according to very ancient traditions, each inhabitant of this barbaric country had only one eye in the center of the forehead. The king having, as he must, lent faith to these discourses, it since had become a fundamental dogma of the Siamese that Occidentals only had one eye. We are, with respect to the Orientals, in nearly the situation that the inhabitants of Siam are with respect to ours. If the little that we know of their visage prevents us from saying that they have only one eye, we do worse, for we deny them taste and soul, end quote. To read literature comparatively, Jones suggests, across languages and cultures, one needs the consciousness of, if you will pardon the pun, a Siamese twin. The ability to apprehend one's prejudices, today we might say racism, and the limits of one's knowledge by watching or listening to oneself being watched or overheard by another. In this case, by seeing the West represented and hearing it played back through the eyes, ears, and voice of a fictional or fictionalized king of Siam. Comparatism is the critical recognition that what you cannot see, cannot hear, and do not know, nonetheless exists apart from you and is worth knowing on its own terms, and with awareness also of the self. Notice that I do not say what you do not see and do not know and do not hear. Jones tells us that it does not matter to the king of Siam that he actually has seen Occidentals, the Jesuit missionaries who have visited his kingdom, if by seeing one means sense perception. He has seen these beings, but cannot see them, or the foreign peoples they represent, for the human beings they are. For his mind's eye, sight beyond sense perception, conceives these foreigners as non-human animals, as monkeys, and does so on the basis of the discourse to which it is routinely exposed, what courtiers, priests, and philosophers say. Saying trumps seeing, rationalism, what the mind conceives on its own, trumps empiricism. I speak of this remarkable passage as the opening of Jones's dissertation. Yet even before that opening, the book's epigraph invites the 18th century Western reader to relocate the very impulses of exploration and comparative knowledge from Europe to other continents. It is a pronouncement in Arabic, as you will see on the slide. اطلبوا العلم ولو كان بالصين. Cherchez le savoir fût-il à la Chine, Jones translates. Seek knowledge, be it in China. Later, Jones identifies the Prophet Muhammad as the author of that pronouncement, arguing that it proves, quote, that letters and fine arts are held in the greatest esteem by the Orientals, end quote. The statement indeed is a well-known hadith, or saying, of the Prophet, for whose earliest followers in 6th to early 7th century Arabia, China would have marked the limit of the known world. If one Orient, Siam, sets the stage for a counterfactual parable that unmasks the dangers of Eurocentrism and of all intellectual absolutism, another Orient, Islam, models for Jones an antidote to absolutist thinking, the quest for knowledge beyond one's sights and hearing, and thus the project and the profit, P-R-O-F-I-T, of comparison itself. Even though Muhammad here only speaks of China metaphorically, writes Jones later in the text, we might hear it literally, for we are persuaded that Chinese literature is as useful as it is interesting. Still, in invoking the Orient as a possible model for comparative knowledge, Jones consigns Arab-Islamic comparison to metaphor, to figurative language, to saying. Seeing is the province of the European, who is able to conceive of China literally, to the letter. The Orient may model an idea, but the Occident is poised to put that idea to empirical test. And I quote from Jones, "Those who do not know the languages of Orientals make incompetent judges of their poetry." But here is an experiment, and his term is une expérience, that would obviate that error, which one advises you to try. That one would take two odes, and here he shifts to another Orient, one Persian, one Arabic or Persian, the other Greek or Latin, translate these almost word for word in a language of common use, with no ornament or disguise, grant what is due to the diversity of idioms, places, and customs of both sides equally, and that then one would pronounce without prejudice between the productions of Orientals and the works that we admire every day, end quote. Presaging contemporary U.S. comparatists like Gayatri Spivak and Emily Apter, who see language acquisition as key to a comparative literature that shuns the world dominance of English, Jones argues that those who do not know Oriental languages cannot judge their literatures. Yet he proposes a workaround that permits such judgment, one that depends, in fact, on translation into a third language, a language of common use, une langue usitée, known both to writer and reader, and moreover, into the plainest form of that language, a linguistic and stylistic lowest common denominator. To make two literatures comparable, Jones tells us, the scholar must in effect shear away all ornament, all markers of style, which he associates not only with excess, but also with disguise, and translate both literatures, nearly word for word, into the plainest prose one can. Then one can judge, he says, then one can compare. This experiment reconverts comparison into an act of empirical observation and Baconian induction or generalization from observed particulars, even if they are reduced particulars. For if poems from two different languages and literary traditions can be translated into a third language of common use, their features supposedly will be more easily discernible to the naked European eye and ear. Jones proceeds to illustrate his method. To bring an alien Orient into comparison with a familiar West, he translates two odes, one from Persian by Hafiz, the other from Latin by Horace, and juxtaposes these. Having done so, he concedes that the reader who does not know the original expressions and the literary traditions of these poems will fail to grasp the felicity of their expressions and the elegance of their allusions. Yet he insists that any such reader can look at Hafiz and Horace, reduced to plain French, and decide ultimately which of the two odes is the more poetic, a quality he premises on what he calls charming simplicity. While he says that it is not up to him to decide, he drops heavy hints in favor of the Persian. But when the comparatist or translator breaks language down into what we might call molecular units, here words, where does style go? Jones wants the European reader to hear the music of Oriental poetry, yet translation pressed into the service of comparison would, it would seem, reduce the unique musical phrasing of the Persian and the Latin, respectively, to mere strings of common, simplified, decontextualized notes, more readily exchangeable. To demonstrate the aesthetic value of Oriental literatures to the European reader, Jones ultimately must prove the soundness in all senses of their languages, that is, that the sounds of those languages are melodious enough to merit and justify the name poetry. Translating the sense of the Persian into common French words is not adequate to that task. Thus, Jones goes on to transliterate into Roman characters the Persian ode by Hafiz that he has just translated and placed in comparison with the Latin ode by Horace. And what is striking here is the apology that follows this transliteration. And I quote from Jones, "Although one should only judge the sweetness of a language by the ear, we fear that the majority of readers will appreciate it by the eye, and that they will be put off by the frequency of consonants and of hard letters, lettres dures, that they will see there. But the organ, i.e. the tongue, articulates the chas as easily as it does any other consonant. It is the Tuscan pronunciation of ch and of c in the word cavallo, which has something very gentle about it when it is not too affected." End quote. Thus the Persian kha, kh, it's transliterated as kh, which appears only once in the word khulq, which as in Arabic means temperament, in the transliterated ode, is assimilated to the Tuscan ch, or hard c, like the c in cavallo, where it's not a ch, but it's an attempt to render the sound ch. From common sense and sensibility, we enter the province of common sound. The comparison of letters, literature, is rooted here in the letter, a common denominator more radical than the word, a written character or grapheme, whose shared spoken sound, or forcibly shared spoken sound, or phoneme, the European reader is invited to hear. With his turn to the speech of Tuscany, the dialect of Dante, to bring the literatures of the Arab-Islamic Orient to life for the European reader, Jones inaugurates, perhaps in spite of himself, a new tendency in the discourse of European literary comparison. That tendency would replace Orient with Occident as its fundamental model. Comparative Literature, 1886, the first English language monograph to explicitly articulate the nature and the method of the modern discipline, the Irish barrister and classicist Hutchison Macaulay Posnet traced the root of comparative literary method to Dante's De Vulgari Eloquentia, on eloquence in the vernacular, written between 1302 and 1305, which argued that the time had come for the spoken dialect of Tuscany to vie with, if not to supplant, Latin as a language of writing. And here I show you the particular edition that happens to be in the rare books collection of the Library of Congress. There are many such editions, of course, in libraries elsewhere, but this one was owned by Walt Whitman. And there is a little card from, I think, the old card catalog, or replica thereof, which shows that Walt Whitman listed the pages on the half-title page, listed all of the pages where his name appeared in Posnet's study of comparative literature. So, our typical egocentrism is at work. Yes. And you will see that the volume was part of an international scientific series, which is interesting in terms of the placement of comparative literature in the modern 19th century sciences. Yes. So I quote now from Posnet, from the relevant passage where he speaks of Dante's De Vulgari Eloquentia. When Dante wrote De Eloquio Vulgari, this is Posnet's reference, it's usually called either De Vulgari Eloquio or De Vulgari Eloquentia, he marked the starting point of our modern comparative science, the nature of language, a problem not to be lightly overlooked by the peoples of modern Europe, inheriting, unlike Greek or Hebrew, a literature written in a tongue whose decomposition had plainly gone to make up the elements of their own living speech. The Latin, followed at an interval by the Greek Renaissance, laid the foundations of comparative reflection in the mind of modern Europe. End of quote. Posnet rightly identifies the nature of language as a key starting point of modern comparative literature. Yet not just any language, for Posnet invokes, as a key force that throws language and literature open to comparative reflection, as he calls it, the rise of modern Italian or French, once spoken variants of Latin, the written lingua franca of Western Europe, as languages of writing in their own right. Thus, a particular register of language, the vernacular, grounds the literature that comes to be defined as the proper object of modern comparison. To enter the zone of modern comparison as Posnet defines it, it seems, a literature must be living speech realized in writing. In the language of a comparable literature, death can only survive if it is an intrinsic part of life. Death must be transmuted into dying, decomposition, and it must also, in being so transmuted, reconstitute the living in perpetuity. Forms of language that precede and exceed living speech suddenly seem waste of breath. It is not that languages inassimilable to living speech don't breathe. They do, even if their respirations are sometimes unvocalized. In this regime of the modern, of comparison, of literature, they can't breathe. They're not allowed to breathe. I turn the page now 1 century earlier to Volney's Simplification des langues orientales, Simplification of Oriental languages, published in Paris in 1795. A text that, as I have also learned here in the rare books collection of the library, Thomas Jefferson once owned. And Jefferson, in fact, owned many works by the Comte de Volney, who voyaged, in fact, to Egypt and Syria in the 1780s and writes another text on that series of travels. In addition to the rise of the vernacular, Posnet noted the European discovery of the New World as a decisive element in the emergence of modern comparative sensibility. Yet in Volney's estimation, Europe did not need to voyage so far away to discover the sort of radical difference that awakens the impulse of comparison. Its familiar, the Arab-Islamic world, was, in many ways, its most radically foreign. A dividing line of contrasts has stubbornly persevered, Volney writes, for many centuries between the Asiatics, above all the Arabs, and European peoples, We are separated by only 60 nautical hours from Algiers and from Tunis. Just 14 days take us to Egypt, to Syria, to Greece, 18 to Constantinople. And yet one would say that these peoples inhabit another planet. That, though contemporaries, we live separated by several centuries. The crude observer, le vulgaire, is content to see, as the reason for these contrasts, the difference between religions, mores, customs. But this difference itself has its causes, and one finds that the most powerful, indeed perhaps the only such cause, consists of the difference of languages. End of quote. While various points in the Ottoman Empire are within short sail from Europe, and all seem on the surface temporally proximate, contemporains, contemporaries, they are, to borrow the phrase of Johannes Fabian, in Time and the Other, denied coevalness with Europe. They're not allowed to occupy the same time, the same chronology. The most spatially proximate is the most historically distant, separated by centuries. And the historical gulf between is measured and fathomed in, through, and as language, in the nautical miles of a vernacular vision of language. And I quote again from Volney, "I count for little the contrast in the movement of Arabic script, which, while we trace our lines from left to right, traces its own from right to left, and begins a book where we finish it. But a third difficulty, the most serious, the most radical, is its alphabetic system itself. It is the incomplete, indeed perverted, the word used here is vicieuse, which has a strong moral cast, indeed perverted manner in which Arabic depicts the spoken word." And the phrase is peint la parole. In our languages of Europe, every element of that word, vowel, consonant, aspiration, all is painted or depicted with detail, precision, scruple, and clear images passed through to the mind. We even regard a language as all the more perfect, insofar as its script more exactly paints or depicts all of its pronunciation, as that language is written as it is pronounced. By contrast, in Arabic and its analogues, Ge'ez, Persian, and Turkish, not only does one not write as one speaks, but one writes really only half of one's words. In the main, only consonants are outlined, which are its principal base, and the 4 long vowels depicted in the alphabet, the 3 short vowels that play the greatest role in pronunciation and that are an integral part thereof are suppressed and implied. One must supply these from imagination and do so impromptu. End of quote. What makes Arabic and its users so radically different from the languages of Europe and their users, Volney suggests, is its incomplete and even perverted binding of letter, of written sign, grapheme, to sound, phoneme, to image, and ultimately also to sense. Arabic writing, so goes the charge, does not depict spoken words or does not paint them with sufficient faithfulness to the sounds they ostensibly must recall or to the images they ostensibly must conjure forth. In such a system, enunciation is not simply a question of prendre la parole, taking the floor, launching the word. It is rather the spoken word. It is rather a question of peindre la parole, painting or depicting the spoken word. And to the extent that the writer of Arabic writes only half words, he or she eats them, no longer able, in Volney's judgment, to communicate and thereby to enter the sphere of positive comparability. Failing to mark, in most cases, the short vowels that would make its rendering in script fully identical to sound, fully representative and transparent, calling on its reader to supply sound from silence, to fill in the blanks, swirling above and below the lines of text from the real-time reservoir of his or her imagination, to bring voice to mute speech, Arabic enters this French regime of comparison as defective and defects from this world. Volney's argument inflects Ernest Renan's reading of written versus dialectal or spoken Arabic in his Histoire générale et système comparé des langues sémitiques, General History and Comparative System of Semitic Languages, first published in 1855. Here, as in Volney, the absence or presence of the vowel in Arabic letters marks an opposition of the death of Semitic languages to the contrasting life of their Indo-European counterparts. And I quote from from Renan, "The habit of not writing vowels, thereby effacing the subtle nuances in which inheres all individuality of the dialects, reduces Semitic texts to a sort of skeleton, excellent for the anatomical study of language, but hardly proper to the study of movement and of life. And a language that is not life for Renan is not historical and not comparable. Languages must be compared, he writes, to living beings of nature. Their life, like that of man and humanity, is a perpetual becoming, end quote. What emerges is an opposition of Indo-European languages, which occupy a distinctly Hegelian state of perpetual becoming and are thus living because historical because living, to Semitic languages. These languages, Arabic in particular, are dead because, in Renan's invocation of terms that the German philosopher Hegel infamously reserved for Africa, they, quote, no longer have a history, non plus d'histoire, end quote. Dubbing Arabic the last survivor and, quote, sole representative of Semitism, end quote, an interesting statement in itself, Renan sees it as absolutely unique, the incomparable distillation, summation, and perfection of a family of languages whose lives have ended. Quote, written without the slightest nuance of dialect, end quote, Arabic and other Semitic languages are fixed in what he calls a metallic rigidity that blocks all developed interior life. Compared with Indo-European languages, so essentially vegetal and living, Renan writes, Arabic and its kin are inorganic and mineral. Everywhere, he writes, an ancient language gives way to a vernacular, une langue vulgaire, a modern dialect corresponding to a progression of analysis, clearer, more explicit, separating that which the ancients assembled, breaking the mechanisms of the former language to grant to each idea and to each relation its isolated expression, end quote. Formal Arabic, Renan suggests, is an exception. It has not evolved toward the modern dialect, the vernacular. Arabic is, in a word, too composed. Failing to decompose, as vegetal life does, into isolated fragments, Arabic and its Semitic cousins supposedly have not followed the natural way of language toward simplification, but held fast to a problematic complexity, read artificiality. And I quote again from Renan, this agent of decomposition is entirely missing from Semitic languages. Not a single letter has been lost. Guarded by closed and precise mouths, they have very rarely fallen into jargon. The three fundamental articulations of each root have remained a sort of bone structure that has preserved them from all softening. The Semitic script system, for its part, has contributed in no small part to this phenomenon of persistence. One cannot say that Semites write in a manner as perfect as the Indo-Europeans. They represent only the skeleton of words. They render the idea rather than the sound. Latin and Italian, written after the Semitic manner, would hardly differ one from the other, but one cannot deny that this writing system, so inconvenient to the foreigner, has not been excellent for the conservation of roots. It has maintained the root as a sort of perfectly pure diamond across all grammatical accidents, end quote. Both the letter and the usually trilateral root of formal Semitic languages, jealously guarded by the essentially mute, closed mouths of its speakers and, by extension, equally mute pens of its writers, not only do not change, but also do not sound. As bone structure, skeleton, perfectly pure diamond, Arabic and related languages are mineral. In Renan's most charitable reading, precious mineral, yet dead nonetheless in their immunity to alteration. Rather than going the way of Latin to Italian and undergoing the decomposition associated with living speech, as Posnet too later would suggest the language of a comparable literature must, they have fossilized. For Volney and Renan, Arabic is at once the litmus test and the limit of comparison for the sciences of the European long 19th century. Arabic letters, in every sense of that term, spell the fate of what enters the sphere of comparison and what lies beyond its pale. This, too, is true for the modern discipline of comparative literature. I return to Posnet. Insofar as Posnet roots modern comparative literary method, as we have seen, in the rise of the vernaculars in Europe, and insists in turn that that method must be historical, the degree to which a written language coincides with its spoken form signals its historicity and comparability. Small wonder, then, that he invokes the Arab-Islamic literary tradition as the avatar of incomparability, and I quote, "If we are determined to lay down the dogma that Shakespeare or Dante or any other poet wrote above space and time, above the social and physical conditions under which he lived, we really exclude historical propriety by a creed of literary inspiration which has been frequently asserted, if not believed in, with theological assurance. We imitate the criticism of the Arabs and make a literary Quran out of our Shakespeare or Dante," end quote. The literary Quran is Posnet's metaphor for the transformation of Shakespeare and Dante by the Western critics who canonize them into incomparable divinities whose ambit is universal and timeless rather than historically grounded in place and time. Those critics' method, he argues, and I quote, "is almost as fatal to true historical science as the Muslim belief that the language and ideas of their Bible came direct from God himself," end quote. The entanglement of the doctrine of the inimitability of the Quran with the incomparability of its language, Arabic, is now a kind of a shorthand for a theological impulse that must be banished from the epistemic sites of comparative literature, which must be true to historical science. Paradoxically, Shakespeare and Dante are often divinities of this new historical scientific literary order, marshaled to tighten the umbilical cord between the vernacular and the rise of modern, properly comparable European literatures. It is thus in the negative as that which is deemed incomparable, uniquely defective in its otherworldly perfection by most Western scholars, and increasingly over the imperial course of the long 19th century, in complex ways by Arabic-speaking intellectuals, that Arabic enters a transcontinental theory of modern comparative literature. Together, they would ask, what kind of language forms a properly modern and worldly Arabic literature? Writing in 1893 in the Cairo periodical Al-Azhar, Sir William Willcocks called on Egyptians to shed formal written Arabic, Fusha, a purportedly artificial, dead language, he calls it such, and to write in the vernacular or colloquial, Ammiya, instead. Lack of a natural, embodied, living literary language, he opines, stymies the originality that drives scientific invention, hence modernity. An Anglo-Indian engineer, Willcocks arrived in Egypt in 1883, 1 year after the British occupation. He redesigned Egypt's irrigation system and, as Director General of Reservoirs, designed and supervised the construction of the first Aswan Dam between 1896 and 1902. Willcocks maintained that just as British engineering had freed the Egyptian peasant from forced labor, so too would British promotion of Egyptian Arabic unshackle the Egyptian intellectual from coercive artifice. Indeed, his first paper on the language question, itself delivered in formal Arabic, it was delivered before a club in Cairo, the Egyptian club in Cairo, and this is a printed text, transcript of the talk, argued that modern Egyptians had lost the scientific creativity they had possessed in ancient times because, quote, the authors of their scientific secular books write language hard as rock, literally like mountains, and, quote, set down thoughts in books to die, never to return to life, as if they are entombing them in paper and burying them between the covers of books, end quote. Contrast English. With the rise of vernacular English, Willcocks argues, came not only the works of the celebrated English poet Shakespeare, but also those of Sir Francis Bacon, who, he writes, quote, penned the lessons to which the European sciences owe their first appearance. In June 1893, in the same journal, Al-Azhar, Willcocks would attempt to bring his point to life, publishing his translations of passages, short passages from Shakespeare's Henry IV and Antony and Cleopatra into colloquial Egyptian Arabic. What follows these translations is an Arabic language discussion of hydraulic engineering by an Egyptian that appears to bear out Willcocks's correlation of lived language to scientific ingenuity, were it not for the inconvenient fact that that discussion is in formal written Arabic, as was Willcocks's original call for the use of the colloquial as a language of science. Paradoxically, the language of empirical science is often at odds with its philosophical premises. Empiricist discourse privileges matter over mind. Indeed, it insists that direct observation of matter should decide human axioms about nature and, in effect, make up our minds. Yet it couches its findings in standard languages very often that occupy an abstract relation vis-a-vis the daily texture of material reality. In using formal Arabic to trumpet empiricism, Willcocks brings home a Bacon he surely meant to leave behind. For while Willcocks upholds Bacon as an exemplar of vernacular ingenuity, Bacon wrote his Novum Organum, New Organon, 1620, in Latin, not English. And the same problem, in fact, afflicts Dante. He has to write his apology for Tuscan in Latin, in effect, in order to make it reach a wide audience. Willcocks's essay struck a chord with the epistemic anxieties of 19th century Arabic-speaking intellectuals. Writing in 1893 in his periodical El Ustad, The Teacher, whose pages up to that point often did feature articles in the Egyptian colloquial, the Egyptian nationalist Abdullah Nadim debunks Willcocks's assumption that written Arabic is not up to the task of modern science or modernity itself. How could Willcocks allege that formal Arabic had stalled Egyptian capacities for scientific invention, he opines, when Renaissance Europe had taken much of its science from Arabic? Moreover, even modern Egyptians who have learned European languages, and Nadim writes, still use Arabic as a language of intellectual production, writing books and newspapers and stories of their own, as well as translating European scientific texts into Arabic. 12 years earlier, in an 1881 issue of his first weekly, Tenqit with Tabkit, which can translate as raillery and reproach, and Nadim, writing in the long wake of the 1798 to 1801 French occupation of Egypt and on the eve of the 1882 British occupation, perceived the seductions of French and English in the shadow of European imperialism. In an essay titled إضاعة اللغة تسليم للذات, The Loss of Language is a Surrender of the Self, he warned against the abandonment of Arabic. Taking the form of an open letter, the essay's salutation reads, أيها الناطق بالضاد, literally, O you who pronounces the letter Dad, meaning O you who speaks the language of the Dad, which is a common epithet for Arabic. With that direct address to his reader, and Nadim signals the uniqueness of Arabic, hence its incomparability, or at least its non-exchangeability, by invoking the consonant Dad. It's a hard D sound said to occur in no other language. The letter opens with a series of impassioned interrogations. For what do you exchange your language? What is comparable to it? For whom do you abandon it when you are its guardian, grantor? What have you found so beautiful in other languages and so ugly in its analogous features? I ask you to swear, by God, have you found in the modern languages what your ancient language encompasses? When you express something with a word from a language besides your own and then wish to elaborate on it with another expression, do you find even one synonym for it, as you find in your language a cluster of synonyms for any given word? Are you the one ignorant of the power of your language? End of quote. What Europeans like Renan regarded as a feature alongside its unwritten short vowels that makes Arabic incomparably defective, namely the abundance of words that express the same idea, is what makes Arabic for a Nadim incomparably rich. That within Arabic lie infinite possibilities for exchange is precisely and paradoxically for him what should inhibit, if not prohibit, its speakers and writers from exchanging Arabic for other languages. And Nadim recognizes, however, why his Arabic language readership has come to compare its language with others. He understands that his readership judges the currency, modernity of a written language by its proximity to living speech, and thus is tempted to exchange a dead ancient Arabic for live modern languages. Yet the threat of the foreign, and in this case for Nadim, the foreign is deeply linked to colonialism. He was an anti-colonial nationalist, fighting the British occupation as well as involved in anti-Turkish agitation. Yet the threat of the foreign and Nadim counters is historically what has divided written from spoken Arabic. And Arabic, secure in its power, need not reject speech. It is the failure of Arabic, historical and contemporary, to ward off the intrusion of foreign words on its grammar that gradually separated, he argues, the Arabic of the pen from that of the tongue, making its pages defensive. And I quote from a Nadim, I do not prohibit you from other languages besides your own. Rather, I wish only to remind you that your language once was spoken, kana mantuqan, without the study of a manuscript, without a book. With the intermixing of the foreign word, it was somewhat corrupted, In fear of its loss, it was recorded in the bowels of pages. Its power remained in writing until its foreign words grew so numerous that writers opted for these. Then foreign words multiplied such that it, the original language, was exchanged for a conventional language. The word is بلغة اصطلاحية, a language born of usage, that followed no grammatical rule. The catastrophe has grown. Writers have crowned the transformation by speaking the colloquial with long expression, a third of which is foreign to both its original and its conventional languages. End of quote. Notice that Nadim positions Arabic in historical cycles of corruption by and incorporation of the foreign. Here in original Arabic, in which the spoken and the written coincide, gives way, thanks to the intrusion of foreign words, to a conventional Arabic that is no longer pure enough to obey rules, but operates instead as a hybrid language whose correctness can be determined, presumably, only by contingent usage. That Arabic, in turn, has given way to a loose, colloquialized writing so replete with foreign words, in his estimation, that it transgresses even convention. Respecting, we might say, neither statutory nor common law, this Arabic has broken with all pasts. And Nadim's polemic provoked a powerful rejoinder from Amin Shumail, the Syro-Lebanese publisher of the journal Al-Hukuk, Rights or Law. Writing within the month in Nadim's newspaper, so in Tenkit with Tebkit, Shumail challenged the vitality of formal written Arabic. For Shumail, that Arabic increasingly lacked a market even among its native speakers. The conjunction of imperialism and global capitalism drives his suggestion that speakers of Arabic abandon their language, at least as a language of writing, and embrace French or English as the lingua franca of imperial power, capital, and modernity. Insisting that, quote, language is but a material instrument with which the exchange of ideas and meanings is transacted between human individuals, end quote, Shumail premises the life or death of language on history, understood neither as continuum nor as cycle as Nadim would have it, but as rises and falls that are the upshot of material causes, contingencies of power and money. Inasmuch as language is, for Shumail, only an instrument, آلة فقط, it, quote, holds no precedence as such. Its might and the decline of its status are rather the outcome of the attributes of its people, power and weakness, end quote. Language, he writes, is, and I quote, a mirror in which the self-images of its peoples shatter, end quote. Rather than represent the power, the position and the power of a people in the world, language refracts that position through material filters of political power and scientific progress. So rather than a one-to-one reflection, you have a refraction. Absent power and progress, the capacity to compare or compete with the modern and to convey the modern, no beauty or eloquence, Shumail argues, can save a language. Languages die, he might say naturally, with the decline of the peoples who use them, and rightly so. In this fate, he suggests, Arabic will join Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin, languages whose long canonicity, hence survival, makes them, quote, more closely resemble the living in the image of the dead, end quote. Shumail now assumes in reverse the empiricist posture of the young William Jones. He advises Nadim and his ilk to undertake an experiment and to observe what they see, to place Arabic literature in a purely material comparison with foreign, read European literatures, and witness the shattering of, in every sense, Arabic's currency. And I quote, "Go to our lending libraries and our mercantile centers," Shumail writes, "and see how much a book in Arabic," which he calls a daldi, so he uses the letter dad to signify Arabic. See how much a book in Arabic rents for versus how much a book in a foreign language, which he calls dali, softy sound, rents for. Then write a book entirely in Arabic, spend your whole life on it, and offer it to your people, and you will see that there is no market for your goods, end quote. Shumail attributes the decline of Arabic in modernity to its exceptionalism, to precisely the sort of incomparability Nadim enshrines in the letter dad, that hard D sound said to occur in no other language. To pronounce the letter dad is to interdict or to forbid the comparability and thus the exchangeability of Arabic, and to declare that no language can adequately compensate for another. To enter the world of commodity exchange, of the profitable production and consumption of knowledge, Shumail intimates, Arabs should go the way of the world, of the letter del, the ubiquitous soft D sound that Arabic shares with other languages and that makes Arabic, on the almost molecular level of the phoneme, comparable. Oddly recalling Volney and Renan, as well as Jones, this vernacular turn again hinges on the letter. Yet by accenting the consonant, not the vowel, as the locus both of Arabic incomparability to date and its modern potential to be comparable, Shumail's literary comparativism, on this point, like in Nadim's, which equally accents a consonant, also reverses and subverts the terms of European scholarship. And Nadim's essay of 1893 correlates Willcocks's call on Egyptians to write in the vernacular. This later essay of 1893 correlates Willcocks's call on Egyptians to write in the vernacular with Shumail's earlier call on Arabic speakers to write in foreign languages. He sees both as calls to abandon literary Arabic. Against Willcocks and Shumail, Nadim writes, quote, "The correct language is the living, given its use by the wise of the community." And he's referring by correct language to the formal language, to formal Arabic. Is the living, given its use by the wise of the community, elite or common, and the colloquial language, or the vernacular, is the dead, given its disuse for all but the necessities that a language-less animal requires, end quote. It's quite a statement. Speech exiled from grammar, which is not always tantamount to writing, but is often fixed and secured through writing, is speech exiled from the past. And that ahistoricity is, for Nadim, the ultimate corruption, collapsing the human into the non-human animal. The life he imputes to correct Arabic rests in its continuity with the past, its capacity as culture bearer and bearer of belief, its capacity to carry time for all who use it across Christian, Muslim, and Jewish lines in this particular context, and to carry belief across time for Muslims in particular, since formal Arabic is, structurally speaking, the language of the Quran. The dialectal is dead because it is presentist, more easily divorced from the long historical continuity of Arab Islamic tradition. That it changes with the moment is borne out by the fact that foreign words compose 1/3 of its lexicon. Yet Nadim makes it clear that he is not opposed to the influence of the foreign on Arabic. 19th century Arabic writers, after all, have successfully translated many European language works into standard Arabic. His point is that formal Arabic is at once adequate to the foreign and responsible to the self, a language into which modernity is translatable even as it preserves and reinvigorates so-called tradition. For Nadim, then, Shumail's call to abandon the incomparable language of the Dad for a more easily exchangeable language of the Dal is, by Arabic terms, a tahrif, from harf. So tahrif is a distortion at the level of the letter, which in Arabic is harf, they share one root, of Arabic's potential to be worldly, be modern, and at the same time be itself. Life demands artifice, the formal preservation through writing of continuity to brave death. I shift here toward a conclusion, moving in a different vein. In 1899, Selim Shibli Haddad, a Syro-Lebanese portrait artist resident in Cairo, I can skip ahead, this is one of the portraits that Haddad painted, received a US patent for new Arabic typefaces for typewriters or printing presses. In his application, Haddad argued that his invention had reconstructed and reduced to a mere 58 characters the 638 different characters required to represent the 29 letters of the Arabic alphabet in their relative positions to other letters: initial, medial, terminal, standalone. By 1904, typewriters featuring Haddad's keyboard were in use in Cairo and Istanbul, as well as by Turkish and Persian officials right here in Washington, and Haddad traveled to the United States for an extended period to promote their mass production. In the 15 May 1904 issue of the major periodical Al-Hilal, The Crescent, published in Cairo, Haddad's Arabic typewriter features prominently. An unsigned article detailing his invention, presumably penned by the editor of Al-Hilal, Georgi Zaydan, argues that mechanized writing, faster and clearer than handwriting, has become common in, and I quote, European nations and the rest of the civilized world, end quote. And there's a strong accent on civilization in this piece. On 21 August 1904, the New York Times, in turn, published an unsigned interview with Haddad, trumpeting his invention thus. An artist-inventor from Mount Lebanon, Selim Haddad's new alphabet and typewriter will facilitate study of Oriental literature. Conjoining the languages of colonialism and capitalism, the Times praises Haddad for having conquered the complexity of the Arabic alphabet and reduced it to the requirements of a business office. More to the point of my lecture today, it conflates two kinds of Arabic letters, the Arabic alphabet and Arabic literature, and imagines that the simplified machine translation of the Arabic alphabet will extract Oriental literature from the obscurity to which its alphabetic complexity supposedly has doomed it, and make it accessible to the world, presumably by permitting its mass production and circulation to wider readerships. And I quote from this article, "The whole world will be enabled to know the wonders of Oriental literature, which has been hitherto impossible, except in a very slight degree to scholars. Even a foreigner who has merely dipped into the subjects of Oriental literature knows of their wonderful richness and luxuriance. The difficulty of research will be rendered far less. The peculiar bulk and complexity of the Arabic alphabet have made the riches of these literatures as inaccessible as unmined gems." End of quote. Seen through the eyes of its US observers, Haddad's invention takes us back to the 18th century world of Jones and Volney. Jones struggled to make the wealth, la richesse was his term, of Oriental literatures accessible to European readers by simplifying Persian letters. First translating words into the plainest French, then transliterating sounds into Roman script, into an assimilated script. Volney complained that Arabic failed to paint its words faithfully, that is, failed to visually represent all of its sounds to the letter. He too sought to simplify Arabic, Persian, and Turkish by devising a Roman script that would articulate their hidden sounds. By the end of the 19th century, thanks to the invention of Haddad, a painter no less, modern Arabic print culture would heed the siren song of simplicity. Yet it would do so in a different key. Haddad adapted the structural logic of the Arabic alphabet to that of the languages of Imperial Europe. That is, he reconstructed a script whose letters articulate movement, changing shape with their relative position within a word, to behave as much as possible like the isolated letters of printed English or French. Yet the Arabic of his new century calligraph, like the Arabic of thinkers as divergent as Nadim and Shumayl, did not give up the consonant, the hard letter, as the mediating principle between the past and future of Arabic or between Arabic and other languages. Haddad's Arabic keyboard seems to resist the obligatory marking of short vowels, Volney and Renan, so desired. His patent application specifies no keys for those elements, for those characters. In a new century that reiterates the simplification of Arabic as the condition of its entry into world literary space, Arabic's unwritten short vowels, which continue to rely on speech, vocalized in the mind's ear, to sound their hidden movements, mark a larger and enduring difference from a common ground still overdetermined by Western norms. And that difference, like other such differences in the world, a revolutionary theory of transcontinental comparative literature, one that no longer centers Euro-US paradigms, but embraces polycentrism, must hear. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, Samira, I hope I missed somebody. Yeah.
Curious. In the historical moment,
Uh-huh.
when there was the encouragement to have written Arabic look more like vernacular Arabic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Maybe written English more so than formal French. Well, like French uses a verb tense in writing, but it uses in speaking.
Sure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
whatever it happens to be. Is there any sense of also wanting to reform, like of these folks who are making these arguments
Right.
also wanting to reform their own language?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Volney really struggles with this question in his Simplification. He has to concede at various points that European languages are not necessarily any more rational in their ways of rendering sounds and in alphabetic form. And while he doesn't always touch French, his own language, which after all has silent letters and and other such oddities, if you will, that cannot be reconciled, he does point out that that there are numerous failures also of transcription in European languages. And so part of that argument goes to inform his larger interest in a purely rational, universal alphabet that will somehow eliminate all uncertainties of pronunciation across tongues. But Oriental languages are still nonetheless singled out as being particularly defective for their tendency not to mark short vowels, which, after all, decide in many cases not just the pronunciation of a word, but also its meaning. You know, the difference between two words in Arabic with the same consonantal structure hinges very often on how the short vowels, marked or not, are read, right? So this becomes a particular problem for Volney, but it also is a test case for a larger attempt to rationalize script systems. So no, you're absolutely right. And Arab critics of the impulse toward vernacularization, someone like Abdullah Nadim points out, well, English language scientific texts, he says, are not written in the same register of language as spoken English. You know, that there are differences in register in the languages of texts too. And so he tries to poke holes in what he sees as the false claims of Willcocks, for instance, that a language that approximates that of daily life is somehow a necessity for scientific invention, ingenuity, the production of scientific literature. He recognizes that argument as tendentious. Nonetheless, it also worries. It worries intellectuals like Nadim. It worries his contemporaries. They are concerned that Arabic may lack the currency to somehow convey the modern, and they are in various ways approaching the question of language reform from that space of anxiety. So, yeah. Yes.
Why did Selim come to New York after inventing the Arabic typewriter? He invented it over there.
Yeah.
Was he manufacturing it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Initially, it seems to have been manufactured in, it may have been manufactured in the Middle East because there were machines said to be fabricated in handsome white and gold that don't look like the new century calligraph in circulation. The Khedive of Egypt at the time, Abbas Hilmi II owned one, the Sultan of Istanbul, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, Abdul Hamid II owned one. All of the departments of the Egyptian government, which at that time was a colonial government under the British, in kind of a loose colonial structure. Under Cromer owned one, and all of these departments were using the system. Apparently, when he came to the States, he came under the aegis of his financier, Ismail Bey Raghib, who was the Grand Mason of basically the chapter, the lodge, the Masonic lodge in Cairo at the time, and himself the descendant of an Ottoman Turkish notable. And Ismail Bey Raghib financed Haddad's trip and also financed the larger scale manufacture of these typewriters. And he came to the US, I think, to seek basically a corporate partnership to take this invention to a much larger scale. And so the American writing company, the American Writing Machine Company, new calligraph here. It's an adaptation of the new calligraph typewriter, very popular in this first decade of the 20th century, to an Arabic keyboard. Appears to have been one such. Yeah, it's very interesting. I'm just beginning to trace that. So, so he was here, I believe, about 18 months promoting the invention and, connecting with factories here in the U.S. Yeah. Yes, Chelsea.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. Very helpful.
Thank you.
I'm really interested in sort of the larger project, which you sort of hinted at with all of this. But I mean, particularly how you're situated in relation to sort of conceptions of theories of comparative literature, which is historicized. But what you seem to be getting to at the end, and what I really want to hear more about, is sort of what also you got at with the 1883, and I cannot remember his name, sort of argument about market and local market, and the sort of subversion of those arguments. And so, to what degree are you taking audience or sort of intention in that writing that's being done into account, perhaps more than previous conceptions of what you have? I mean, this idea that certain writers writing for a certain audience are so much more easily sort of put into a comparative lens theory and sort of how is audience and that their attention on the part of the writer to
Right. Implicated. Yeah, that's a really wonderful question. Thank you. I believe you may have been referring to Shumail from 1881, who basically calls for the abandonment of Arabic on the argument that Arabic now lacks a market, even among its native speakers, right? The Arabic language texts, I should say, lack a market, yes. And absolutely, you're right. There is a kind of attention to audience there. It's a specific sort of audience. First of all, it presumes a literate audience. It presumes an audience literate in English and French, the dominant European languages that would have been read in Greater Syria at the time or in Egypt at the time. So when somebody like Shumail says, we should be writing in foreign languages, meaning largely we should be writing in English and French, he's speaking about a very specific, largely elite, and by elite I'm speaking somewhat loosely. You have an emerging bourgeoisie, you have an emerging middle class, but in a certain sense an elite who've been educated at European institutions and European schools and who are reading these languages. So there are problems right there with a particular conception of audience. And Nadim, too, is thinking about audience. Some of his articles prior to Willcocks's treatise were published in colloquial Egyptian. This is by somebody who's arguing, right, against the vernacular. Why did he do this? He saw Egyptian colloquial as effectively a kind of set of training wheels that would enable a less literate population, not wholly illiterate, because it's a population, still a slice of the population, in this case in Egypt. The journal also circulated elsewhere in the Arabic-speaking world, but it was deeply Egyptian in some ways, a slice of the population who at least were conversant enough with the Arabic alphabet and grammatical system that they could even read colloquial Arabic transposed into written form. And he saw it as a stepping stone toward learning formal Arabic. So these questions of audience are there, and they're there with the European writers too. I mean, Jones is trying to think about how to make Arabic and Persian and Turkish poetry appeal to a French audience. So you are right that I think one of the things I'm trying to do is move across scales, to move from this very seemingly odd fascination with something as microcosmic as the grapheme or the phoneme, this minutest unit of language, as a sphere in which comparability is transacted between writers, thinkers, and the readers, to ever widening circles. So things like form or genre or the sensibility of literature are also implicated here. And a text that I didn't touch on in this talk that speaks to yet another leap in this particular discussion yet another leap in this history of the transaction, if you will, of comparability between Arabic and European literatures, is one from 1902 to 1904. It's first serialized and then published as a monograph in 1904 by the Ottoman Palestinian intellectual Ruh al-Khalidi. And it's a history of the discipline of literature, the science of literature among the French and the Arabs. And al-Khalidi says, well, I'm writing this history basically for an audience effectively composed of the semi-literate products of European schools, of schools in the Orient modeled on a European paradigm, right? And it seems pejorative in a way, but al-Khalidi, is extrapolating from that audience to a theory and kind of a new vision of language and literature that argues that tries to resurrect old arguments from 10 centuries earlier in the Arab Islamic tradition and say eloquence resides in the average word, in the word that reaches the widest possible public, the widest possible audience, that reaches the elites and the commons or the masses alike. And so there's an attempt to hit a midpoint in language and then to hit also a midpoint in literary sensibility. So there's something of, you could say, a revolutionary political project there on the one hand, but it's also a project that assimilates Arabic language and literature to some of the ideas we heard today in that, excuse me, now I'm starting to gesticulate wildly, in that he is interested in a language, his notion of clear language or transparent language is one in which word and idea correlate very, very tightly. So one word to one idea. And here you start to hear shades of Renan, who, apart from his, obsession with the question of the vowel, is also very concerned with the abundance of words, with the polysemy of Arabic, and argues that a more developed language is more analytical. One word corresponds to one idea. A language like Arabic is synthetic or complex. That is a defect for Renan. That is a sign that it has not actually progressed in the way that other languages have. And so there's something of a counter-evolutionary paradigm. If we think of biological evolution as a progression from a simpler to a more complex organism, there's an odd reversal of that evolutionary trajectory, even as these theorists are talking about forms of life where Arabic has to simplify. And so in that sense, the middle word, the middle register is revolutionary and yet also in some ways imperial. So that's a beginning of an answer to your wonderful question about audience and how it inflects argument in these texts. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, sure. Thank you. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ted. Thank you all again. Thank you very much. Let's see if I can. So interesting. Yes. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.